Hello, welcome to the Defense One Summit, Outlook 2022. I'm Tara Kopp, the Senior Pentagon Correspondent for Defense One, and I'm honored today to be joined by Brigadier General John Olson, the Mobilization Assistant to the Chief of Space Operations. General Olson has held this type of role in several of our most forefront ideas in defense, including the Mobilization Assistant for Cyber and the Mobilization Assistant for Nuclear Weapons. So we're delighted to have him speak with us today about all of the things that are happening in space and how the US Space Force is best positioning itself for the next year and the next decade to come. With that, Brigadier General Olson, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Tara. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I think for our audience, one of the really interesting concepts, and this dates back to World War II, we know that mobilization and logistics wins wars. But how do you do mobilization in space when there's not, right now, airmen or actual space marines or space airmen or people that we would be sending into space?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, space mobility and logistics, or SML, as we like to call it, is a core part of our doctrine in the Space Force. And it's absolutely, as you aptly mentioned, throughout history, logistics have been the key to success and or failure in those areas where it hasn't been aptly applied. And so for the Space Force, it's absolutely a fundamental part of the equation and key to our success. And what really is included in space mobility and logistics is the ability, transportation to, from, and in space. It's also the ability to maneuver, also the ability to do on-orbit servicing, assembly, repair, maintenance, manufacturing. All those elements comprise a very broad range of activities. And so, as we look, and I do believe we have some slides, if one were to reference slide 8 in that, you could see that as part of this broad ecosystem, this infrastructure ecosystem that's required, we see that maneuvering without regret, otherwise known as the ability to refuel, we think that holds great promise for our architectures and for our systems. So whether they be it satellites or reusable spacecraft or a litany of other elements, all of these can certainly leverage the benefits of a robust space mobility and logistics system.
And how much more complicated has that mobility become in the last month or so since the Russian Asat test? What are you looking at right now? What are you worried about as far as safely getting satellites and people to and from the space station and future launches? What are you going to have to plan for?
Well, that's a really challenging event that occurred on the 15th of November of 2021 here. The Russian Federation recklessly conducted a anti-satellite destructive test, and that's essentially used a direct descent anti-satellite missile, and they went against one of their own satellites, Cosmos 1405, I believe, and 1408, pardon me. And they essentially created over 1,500 trackable debris items and perhaps hundreds of thousands of other smaller objects. And all of this was done at an altitude of 480 kilometers in polar orbit. And so with the International Space Station at 400 kilometers, which has both Russian cosmonauts and, of course, American astronauts. And we even look at the equation and the Chinese with their taikonauts aboard their space station at a similar orbit. This is absolutely an irresponsible and a reckless act, and certainly this kind of behavior is not aligned with the international norms and standards. It is absolutely gross in its impact. And if you look at a quick summary of events similar to this that have occurred, and they've been very few throughout history. But in 2007, China hit its Fengyun 1C satellite, and that was at an altitude of 800 kilometers, and essentially of the original 3,679 trackable pieces of debris, there's over 3,000 that are still in orbit. So that's an indicator of these higher altitudes in low Earth orbit being just a long dwell, creating hazards to freedom of space operations and navigation therein. And you know, if we look at some other events, already we talked about this 15 November, wherein we have at least 1,500 pieces at this 480 kilometer altitude. If we look at 2008 at the United States, we didn't conduct an Asat test like this, but we basically downed through Operation Burnt Frost, downed a failed National Reconnaissance Office satellite, and that created that was at 270 kilometers, and that created 173 pieces of debris at the time, but none of those remain in orbit because of the responsive way with which we executed that. And then if we look at the other major one in 2019, the Indian direct descent launch destroyed their microsat-R satellite. Of the 168 pieces that were trackable from that event at 270 kilometers, only one remains. So that shows with black and white clarity the true numbers and the challenges that these will create. So it's a risk not only to the space stations, a risk to the astronauts, cosmonauts, and taikonauts that are aboard, but it's also a future risk because this presents a debris cloud launched out of a since this vehicle was launched out of Baikonur, it creates a challenging debris cloud that will be there for a long time. So it's really irresponsible, and we absolutely are quite surprised at this. It just simply does not make sense.
From a planning perspective, how does this shape future launches for you, or how does this make your job as the mobilization assistant more difficult?
Well, you know, as a mobilization assistant, my job is really to be the lead reserve assistant or the lead reserve officer supporting the Chief of Space Operations. And so the Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond, leads the entire Space Force. And of course, we're the 6th independent service, and we're the 18th intelligence agency. So space is absolutely our focus, and our responsibility as the United States Space Force, led by General Raymond, is to protect U.S. and allied interests in space. So we fundamentally are focused on freedom of navigation and operations in space. And we think that as a global commons, this is vitally important for all of humanity. And so responsible behavior in space is fundamental to that. It preserves our freedom of action, and that's vital to everything that we want to do. But similarly, you know, as we've seen, space is no longer this peaceful environment. It is now congested, contested, competitive, and a really challenged environment. So as the United States service chartered with the responsibility to protect those U.S. and allied interests in space, we absolutely choose to preserve space as a free environment, but we also must defend our national security interests in that environment. So does this make things more challenging? Absolutely. And that's across the civil, the commercial, and the national security environment, but one which we're very acutely focused on.
And that realm of operating is about to become much bigger. Space Force is talking about potential missions to the moon, having a path that, you know, both commercial and military satellites and assets will likely use. Can you talk a little bit about the Space Force's ideas and planning for this future? Some have called it a space superhighway, and what you all are thinking through and what you all are trying to be best prepared for.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it is actually in space. It's the question. It's the grand strategy question, or opportunity, I would rather say, for our time. As we look at the 21st century, certainly we're standing on the shoulders of the 20th century, the space age, but now in the information age, it's fundamentally important that we have a hybrid space architecture. And what do I mean by a hybrid space architecture? Well, it's one that's actually a twofold play on the word hybrid. One is it's got to be both government and commercial, meaning just like the national or the federal highway systems, which are actually known by the Eisenhower Federal Highway and Defense Systems, just like that enabled transportation and the ability to safeguard our nation and the ability to stimulate commerce and business across the United States, as did the electrical grid and the transcontinental railroad and the internet. All of these great examples of infrastructure underlie this huge opportunity that we have now as we look at space. And certainly we believe that the moon and Earth are integrally tied. You know, we need to have Earth or the moon be part of the Earth-Moon econosphere. But as we look at the economic opportunities being pursued in the lead by NASA with its mission to explore, and by this rich and dynamic ecosystem of the US and our allied and partners in this global commercial space industrial base, it's going to be absolutely essential that we look to that broad area. And what I mean by that is we look at this hybrid space architecture. It includes the government, which should set the standards for interoperability and set the guidelines and the rules of the road, if you will. But it's going to be industry. And just like all those other examples I gave, it's going to be industry that brings that to bear, that brings it to fruition, that builds it out, that creates opportunities in ways that we've never even thought of. So this is really a huge economic opportunity for our nation. But it's not just physical infrastructure. And that's the second part. When I say hybrid, it's both physical and it's digital. Because in the 21st century, data is the most valuable element. And so as we look out at heretofore, it's always been geosynchronous orbit, low Earth orbit, MEO, middle Earth orbit. So LEO, MEO, HEO, and GEO, those have been the focus. But as we look out to the Lagrange point, cislunar space, the environs of the moon, the surface of the moon, as we have US and allied interests there, we're going to have a concurrent need to have awareness. And we call that space domain awareness, SDA. And so it's vitally important that we know, track, and monitor and have cognizance of what's going on there. Likewise, throughout history, as we see with sea lines of communication and transportation, we'll also have space lines of communication and space economies to protect and safeguard. So this stuff isn't super far out in the distance. As we start looking, we have commercial US companies like Advanced Space and Intuitive Machines who are both going to the moon within the next year. So this is right around the corner, and therefore the Space Force, as the lead agency responsible for space requirements among all the joint services, is outlined by the JIROCM 029-21, just signed by General Hyten this June of 2021. That really highlights that this is an important area that we look at, one which we're following the lead of NASA, and we're actually bolstering in strong collaborative partnership with NASA, with industry, with our partners and allies and like-minded nations around the globe. But given that space is a global commons, this absolutely must be done in close close dialogue and discussion and international means and mechanisms.
What does that maybe mid-2020s, late 2020s moon mission look like? And what do you see as the Space Force's responsibility there? Will you be protecting waypoints? Will you have a presence monitoring any sort of future moon base? What are you thinking through?
Well, some of the things that we're thinking about is as I already mentioned, space domain awareness is really important. And one thing I didn't mention as completely as I'd like to is you know, we talk about that hybrid space architecture. We talk about these broad these broader encompassing elements as part of an infrastructure, but underpinning it all is a resilient architecture, and that's really the focus of the Space Force. The Space Force, the Space Force focus is on resilience, because we now know that we have a contested environment. As we just saw on the 15th of November, our competitors around the globe have had a series of irresponsible acts in space. And as much as we do not like that, we also feel that that's a pragmatic reality that we're going to have to know and deal with. And as part of that, a monolithic or a single, the architectures that we have of the past aren't going to be the ones that are going to be sufficient for the future. And so that's really where I'd like to focus on this resilient architecture concept. We already highlighted that space domain awareness is very important. But when we look at this, a resilient architecture is one that's holistic. It's got architecture-based systems solutions rather than platform-based system solutions. And I think a systems of systems approach is exactly what it is. And that'll balance both the effectiveness of the system and its resilience and robustness, survivability, reconstitution. All those are part of the paradigms. Other elements that would really characterize or describe a resilient architecture could include disaggregation or hosted payloads and auxiliary payloads that fly on our prolific, as we already discussed, our prolific commercial missions that will go to the environs of the moon, to some of the places like the Lagrange point, the L1, the L2, Earth Moon L1 and 2, very important points. Likewise, as we see already, the Chang'e 5 or the Chang'e 5 surface and orbiter, they're already on the far side of the moon. We need to have the ability to monitor and maintain visibility on what's going on. So I think that's just a highlighted example. But as these proliferate, we absolutely want to take advantage of that proliferation. And finally, as we've seen just this absolute renaissance in launch for small, medium, and large launch providers, from traditional and many new upstart providers, that gives us the ability to look at rapid reconstitution and to launch from different places using different types of rockets and different launch locations, as we've already mentioned. So I think this is all part of a rich, diverse, vibrant, and commercially leveraged approach. And so that's what we mean by the hybrid space architecture, the resilience architecture. And if you look at it all together, it's really part of an overall space infrastructure that's physical and digital. And as we have this national discussion and dialogue about building and investing in America in terms of infrastructure, I absolutely believe our space infrastructure for the United States needs to be core part of this enabling vision for the future, not just the immediate future, but the midterm and the long term as well.
Immediate future. What sort of resilient architecture do you envision? I mean, in the last 6 months, we've seen China launch the hypersonic missile. We've read reports that it actually maybe launched a secondary object while it was still in the Earth's atmosphere. And all of these different commercial ventures that are now in low Earth orbit, what do you have to do to protect U.S. interests and allied interests in this level of orbit, even before you get to cislunar and beyond?
Well, it's a great question and a timely one, because that indeed did cause us a fair amount of concern. Certainly, we as a spacefaring nation, as we see that kind of capability, it reflects that which we already know, that both Russia and China, they're making significant investments in the space arena in order to address or counter the United States' long pedigree of leadership and extensive use of space. And so as we look at these new capabilities and we certainly reflect and assess, it's definitely has our attention, and yet we are continuing to build and look at options that advance our own capabilities. And as we as we look at China in this domain, certainly their launch cadence has been prolific. They're focused on this, and we see that both in the civil and the government and the military sectors, as well as their commercial sector. But I think the United States focus remains squarely on the freedom and sanctity of outer space. But we will absolutely be prepared to defend U.S. allied interests in space.
And you've seen some of those behaviors in low Earth orbit, or some of those capabilities that are coming online. There's a Chinese satellite with a robotic arm. You're not quite sure what the arm will be used for. There's capabilities to blind. There's probably capabilities to jam. When you talk about resilient architecture, do you mean, and in this disaggregation, do you mean having so many different scattered out U.S. Satellites in this area, in this low Earth orbit, and others, to make sure that you can't just take out one satellite and we lose a critical capability?
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's the fundamental premise and approach, and it is one element of a broader, multi-layer, multi-pronged approach. And we've seen already that we have some incredible capabilities, some exquisite capabilities, but as we look at this modern contested environment, and as we look at that, some of those are kinetic and destructive, as we've already seen demonstrated by Russia most recently and China previously. But as we also know, like you said, they have directed energy, could be lasers or other directed energy types of weapons. Some are temporary, some are permanent. So as we look at that host of threats, and we see those potentially impacting our vital assets in space, whether they be in the Department of Defense or whether they be in the intelligence community, those are fundamental to every part of our daily lives. If you look at space, I think there's no domain with more daily touch, no service with more touch to the lives of the everyday Americans than space. If you look at your communications, your daily weather report, your position, navigation, and timing, the GPS that you use to drive in and avoid traffic. If you look at the scientific benefits, the commercial benefits, it's truly extraordinary. So it's vital to our way of life, but as we've already discussed, it's vital to our modern defense. So it's core for supporting the rest of the joint service capabilities, but we're also supported in that those ground user and launch elements on Earth need to be protected, as well as the space segments. And so there's those four segments of space: ground, user, launch, and space segment, that all can be subject to cyber or directed energy or electromagnetic spectrum attack or kinetic attack. And so as we look at competition in the gray zone, and I think we're absolutely in that right now, as we look at competition in the gray zone, it's all about cyber and it's all about space. And so those two are inextricably intertwined. They're synergistic, they're interdependent. And we generally say there is no space without cyber, and cyber is certainly enabled by space. That's truly what we talk about when we have a global perspective and beyond global, as we've already talked about, all the way out to cislunar space and the moon. And so when we talk about joint all-domain command and control, or JADC2 as it's commonly referred to, that is the system that takes all sensors and connects it to all effectors and has a processing layer in between. That can only really be affected with space delivering the space sensing layer, which is space domain awareness in many regards, space transport, which is communications and data transfer, space networking, whether that be the mesh nodes or the nodes on the very edge, the edge nodes, the nodes out at the very edge of the battle lines, or the mesh cloud networks that are vital and tying in with fiber and space networks to that space command and control. So again, it's space sensing, space transport, space networking, and space command and control. So we are really absolutely dependent upon space, and therefore the United States force exists to preserve and protect those interests.
What do you see the Space Force prioritizing in the next calendar year, and has that changed at all since both the Russian test and the Chinese launch?
Well, our budgetary and prioritization cycles are ongoing, and we have a 2-year POM cycle, as well as a future years defense program that spans a longer period. But we've absolutely been leveraging our SWAC, which is the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, which takes intelligence and which it takes all of these attributes and priorities together, and it leverages our digital service attributes, which we're focused on digital engineering ecosystem, a digital workforce, a digital headquarters, and digital operations. It's basically leveraging both physical and digital capabilities to model and to plan optimal architectures to be able to deal with the threats and challenges before us that are intelligence community and warfighting priorities and defensive and deterrence priorities driven. So that's really an important aspect. That's what's changing with the Space Force. As we talked about, as a mobilization assistant, I served as the acting Chief Technology and Innovation Officer over the summer, where we're really taking the vision for a digital service that we rolled out on the 6th of May and implementing that. And the SWAC is one of those places where we're doing so. So we use digital model-based systems engineering, and we are able to much more quickly and effectively do iterations and do analysis and what ifs and do wargaming and analysis, and that helps us optimize and then refine those models and do it even quicker. So that's a fundamentally important part of our approach, and that allows us to take a look at these new capabilities and to identify areas of opportunity, areas of improvement that are needed, and do so at an ever increasing pace. And really, that's another key attribute about being a mobilization assistant. I spent, as a reservist, I spent 10 years in industry in both public and private organizations, a Fortune 500 company, at multiple levels of officership for the company, from CEO and president to senior strategic vice president, vice president, general manager. So I've seen industry from the eyes of a doer and a user in both public and private. And that's made me a much better government person. And so it's that kind of experience, as well as 10 years in NASA and 2 at the White House, that I bring to the Space Force. So what we're trying to do in this mobilization role is General Raymond brought me in and he said, "Hey, John, I want you to run. And, unless I tackle you and tell you to stop, keep running, because that's what the modern environment is going to need. And you bring together skills that we just simply don't have." And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring that agile, that innovation, that industry focus, speak the language of industry, build a robust and resilient and dynamic U.S. and allied industrial base that'll allow us to have this resilient architecture, that'll allow us to move at the speed of need, that'll allow us to operate in ways that that harness the true entrepreneurial and innovation capacity of the nation. And I think that's what it's going to take to lead, because we are in competition, but the road to crisis and conflict is so quick with some of these adversary weapons. They're really destabilizing. And so from that perspective, we're trying to be very much strategic, operational, and tactical in our thoughts, in our planning, and our deliberate decision making. And so that's the recipe that we're applying here, which we hope will yield great results and success.
I have 2 more for you. You just mentioned that the road to conflict has just become so much quicker and a lot less predictable. And are you thinking about how does the U.S. either deter or retaliate if there is an action taken by an adversary? Say they blind a satellite, or say they destroy a U.S. satellite. what is, I guess, the action that the U.S. government takes, and are you part of that conversation to figure out, how do you deter against that?
Well, I think that's a very timely question, especially for our nation as a whole. This needs to be discussed because, as you mentioned up front, I think deterrence is fundamentally important. If you look at the name for the Space Force, for our people, it's the Guardians, and the Guardians is a great name, very appropriate, because as we know, space is an incredible global commons for all of humanity, and freedom of action and movement there is vitally important. But as we look at this, deterrence becomes very important, and so we're really, as guardians, designed to deter, to protect, to defend. Those are all the first priorities. And as we look at all the instruments of power that the nation can bring to bear, we call that the dime, the diplomatic, the international, the military, and the economic. The military is only one of those four levers. But as we look at that role for the Space Force, and as we look at deterrence, much like I currently fly as an airborne emergency action officer aboard the Looking Glass Airborne Nuclear Command Post, and previously spent time at the Air Force Nuclear Weapons Center, that's really where I built and refined and honed a lot of the discussion as we talk about nuclear modernization and recapitalization. That's fundamentally important to fulfill this deterrence posture that has kept us for well over 75 years from having a major global conflict. And if we look at these ultimate weapons, it is absolutely essential that we also have, for credible deterrence, you got to have the capability and know how to credibly use it and employ it. You got to have the confidence in that capability, and you got to communicate that so that our competitors and our enemies around the globe who wish the United States ill, they can know that we have a credible deterrence through that. Now, you need to have a range of deterrence options, and I think that is vitally important as we look at the criticality of the three legs of the nuclear triad, with the intercontinental ballistic missiles, with the bombers, and with the submarine capacity. Those each serve a specific purpose, and nuclear modernization and recap is very much important to that. But as we talk again about space and cyber, I think we need to, and that's why I'm part of that ecosystem, is building on the nuclear background, building on the space and the cyber and information warfare. Collectively, we apply those, and we need to look at deterrence theory and deterrence applications and apply those. And so that's a big part. We recently completed several exercises, which the biggest one of the year for United States Strategic Command is Global Thunder, which I participated in. We also had Space Thunder this fall. And so these are examples of how we are, as a nation, looking at the integrated total picture for deterrence and defense. And yet this is ever more important because, as we see, as General Hyten and others have outlined, we've seen the tremendous and rapid growth of capabilities both in China and Russia. And I still believe that China, as our national intelligence assessments and with outlined with the most recent briefing to Congress, show China is our pacing threat, but we certainly don't take Russia, Iran, or North Korea at all with a grain of salt. We are vigilant, we're focused, but we're also reasonable and pragmatic, and we're concentrating on what we need to do as a nation to be smart, to be prepared, and to be effective, because that is our role.
Just a quick follow to that, and then I have a last question for you. But in these deterrence discussions, are you thinking through, hypothetically, if Russia or China shot down a US satellite, what is the proportional response? Do you take out a ground station? Do you take out a Russian or Chinese satellite? And how do you prevent that from escalating into a greater conflict?
Well, that's a topic of discussion that's ongoing. It's certainly one that we've been talking about. As I already mentioned, we have a ground user launch and space segment. So you don't always need to respond to a space a space activity with an equal space element. You could have leverage any one of the other domains or any other one of the tools. And the United States preserves a broad tapestry and portfolio of capabilities of varying degrees. So consistent with the situation, consistent with the rest of the DIME elements, the diplomatic, the international, the economic levers that we have. We generally use military as the last resort. And of course, that's as how as it should be. But, as we look at that, as we look at the potential, and certainly we've seen already the capabilities exist, as we look at that and as we develop our tactics, techniques, and procedures, as we develop our strategy and our national thinking at the highest levels, that's absolutely part of what we're looking at, studying, assessing, wargaming, experimenting with, and refining. And so ultimately, each situation is different. Every scenario is going to have a unique set of attributes. And so it really depends. But I will certainly say that the United States, as we said before, will respond in a proportional manner at a time and place of our choosing. And I think that's really effective as a nation, because that leads to the element of surprise, the element of capability applied in an asymmetric way. And I think when we look at it holistically, that's the safest, most productive, and for space, that is very much a mechanism. But we do have, again, the full spectrum of capabilities to defend our national interests and those of our allies and partners in space. And so I think that would be the dialogue and the discussion that goes forward, is for each particular instance, and then communicate that, because as we've already mentioned, you've got to outline where the acceptable lines, the red lines are, the acceptable boundaries and standards and norms of behavior. And as we set those, both in global bodies like the United Nations, but also with partners and allies. And we've seen that in some areas with the Artemis Accords in the civil space arena. We've seen that in discussion in several other fora, military to military and government to government around the globe. I think that's going to be ever more important. And I think the key here is moving so at the speed of need, because as we've talked about, the United States has 2 missions going to the moon in the next couple of months, commercial missions. We have already an ASAT on the 15th. Again, the Russians demonstrating this really irresponsible behavior, which simply doesn't make sense when we look at the impact of the commercial and human spaceflight side of it, which impacts themselves. And then as we look more broadly, I think it underscores that this is an important national dialogue.
Great. Thank you. And for my final question for you, if you would, take us out 5 years, 10 years from now. Where do you see the Space Force? And you've previously said that wherever the Space Force is and whatever developments have occurred, it's important for the U.S. to get there first, whether that's on the moon or that's developing way stations on the Superhighway. And if you could just talk about why it's important for the U.S. to get there first, and what does that mean for the norms in space if the U.S. does not get there first? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Got a lot wrapped up in that question, so I'll unpackage it bit by bit. So for the Space Force, we're coming up on our 2-year birthday, 20 December of this year. We will celebrate our 2-year anniversary. And right now, the Space Force priorities are the following 5: to empower a lean and agile service, to develop joint warfighters in world-class teams, to deliver new capabilities at operationally relevant speeds, to expand cooperation to enhance prosperity and security, and last but certainly not least, to create a digital service to accelerate innovation. And I think, the first year we were inventing the force and we put it into action in the second year. And the third year, it's about expanding and driving forward to those priorities. And, first and foremost, the United States has been a leader as a nation with a storied history in space. being a spacefaring nation, not just one which has space programs, but truly integrating into all aspects, supporting the grand strategies. And that's really the grand strategies is the thing that the president or the executive, the biggest ambitions of a nation, and those are rooted in, economy, security, jobs, healthcare, the environment, education. Space has the ability to transform those in incredible ways in all of them. And as we already talked to and highlighted, it benefits every human being on the face of the planet. And there is no part of your daily life that isn't touched and benefited by space. So we feel this is a sacred responsibility, and as guardians of that responsibility, we think it's fundamentally important to focus on all these opportunities ahead. We see explosive, incredible positive growth the United States has been, and we want to sustain our nation as a leader in commercial space activities. This is launch, in-space activities. You're seeing just a tremendous growth because I think we have a historical inflection point where we have the confluence of technologies, available investment capital, and we have the will. And so as we look nationally from an enabling infrastructure, from a perspective of stimulating a robust and vibrant U.S. and allied space industrial base, because remember, those jobs and those people, at least for now, are all to Earth-based that create our elements in space. But as we look ahead, NASA in the next 5 to 10 years, which was the second part of your question, as we look ahead, I see not just NASA returning to the moon to have the first woman and the first person of color land on the surface of the moon, but I see a vibrant commercial focus there. As we look at SpaceX with Starship, as we look at Blue Origin with Blue Moon, those are just two of the companies and its consortia partners that are going to lead us back. And we need to be there as a nation supporting and enabling. And that is this resilient, robust, hybrid space architecture, one which has a vision that is well out to the moon and perhaps beyond. And that will be stepwise. But I'm really enthused. I absolutely believe that our best years are before us, certainly not behind us. And that's an incredible statement because I believe if you look at going to the moon, that's got to be on the top 3, if not number 1, certainly for me, number 1 accomplishments of all time. And what it taught us is nothing's impossible when you put the time, talent, and treasure of a nation towards a goal. And it also generated 3 or 4 generations of scientists and technologists and engineers and mathematicians and STEM focused for the United States. So our whole economy and security have been based on technology. I think it affords that kind of strategic potential for the future. Therefore, the United States must be first. I believe that first mover advantage is fundamentally important here. Sure, we already landed there in 1969 and sent our Apollo crews there and safely returned them. But that was 50 years ago. The time is now, the moment is now. And as we look at this competition in the gray zone, as we look at this global competition for resources, for opportunities, for exploration, and for the benefits that can leverage so much goodness here on the face of the earth, I think the United States must be first, and that means setting the standards, setting the rules of behavior, the norms. Much like the United States believes in the rule of law and in democracies and freedoms and right for our people, that is fundamentally what we seek to create in terms of world orders and structures. And when we define those and we set those standards, that comes from leadership. And doing so in a strong and an enduring and a sustainable way is absolutely what it's going to take. That's why we need to be first. If we look at it's similar, our competitor in China, as we look at the South China Sea, what once started as Mischief Reef and Fiery Cross as nothing atolls, they've been built up through artificial means. Then they were expanded to include ports and runways, and then they emplaced defensive weapons, quote unquote, and then it's offensive weapons, and then it looks then they create a huge ADIZ, or air defense identification zone, and exclusive economic zones, all in violation of the World Court opinion that favored and ruled for the Philippines. So if we look at that and we extend that further, I have no doubt, especially being a prolific student of the Chinese at a broad level, I have no doubt that they have similar ambitions. And in fact, they stated in numerous documents that they have similar ambitions for the moon. So NASA's going to lead us there, and commercial industry is going to lead us there actually first here in a return just in a couple of months, as we outlined, with first robotic spacecraft, soon to be humans. I absolutely believe that English needs to be that language of space transportation, not Mandarin, much like English is the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, governing body for global air commerce. So I think that is the kind of grand strategy, broad strategic objective. And we call that a North Star vision for the nation. We recently had a State of the Space Industrial Base report that took 232 different companies and organizations and academic interests. Lots of those rich, vibrant participants came and provided just an incredible wealth of information to us. This is the third year in a row that we did it, but this was by far the best. I strongly encourage people to read that, but that outlines one of the key elements that was suggested nearly universally is that this should be a broad national North Star vision for our nation, one that achieves these broad economic goals, because that way we can enrich and improve the lives of all humans here on the earth, certainly led by the United States, because like-minded people who believe in the importance of humanity and the rule of law and rights, that's the way. It's really the good ones that need to lead the way. And so that unpackages your question, but in 5 to 10 years, I'm extraordinarily excited about this. As you can't tell, I'm a little bit passionate about this, but I believe it's absolutely a team sport. This is not just one nation. It's not one organization. This is the whole of government, a whole of nation, and really it's whole of humanity purpose. And I think we realize, and all the recent civilian astronauts who've gone to space see that it changes you. When you see this fragile, relatively small planet in the infinite scope of space, you realize how important it is for us to preserve and protect it. And at the same time, space is what allows us to do that, I believe, in so many constructive and positive and productive ways. And so I'm really excited. 5 or 10 years, it's going to be awesome. In fact, that's why I'm here full time. I am here because this is the moment in our nation's history, and the Space Force is doing things in a lean, agile, innovative way. General Raymond, General Thompson, they are bringing it strong, but it's a total team effort, and we're part of the broader ecosystem. And so we're excited, we're fired up, and we're ready to launch us into that bright, bright future.
Well, General Olson, it's been a pleasure talking to you today, and I suspect that we could keep on talking, but I don't want to tie you up from the rest of your very, very busy day. So if you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share, that would be great. And it's been a pleasure hearing about everything that the Space Force is thinking about and seeing where that 5-10 years will take us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tara. It's been a pleasure. I will leave you with one thing. Now is the time. Now is the time for action. We need to think boldly, and we need to be courageous in our actions. These need to be informed by smart, prudent planning, but we've gotten so much good analysis, so many studies, so many great inputs. Now is the time to act and time to execute, because it is our moment in history, and lead we must. And so let's boldly go forward. And I look forward to future opportunities, because this is definitely going to be an evolving story. So stay tuned, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today, and look to more conversations with General Olson to come.